Thank you so much, guys, for joining us. I'm a big fan of podcasts. Those of you who've seen or watched my podcast, you'll know I love long-form format conversations. And this is what attracted me to be part of State of the Nation. And this is my dream cast. This is people that I would love to talk to and pick their brains. I'm also known as a bit of a conspiracy theorist, apart from being from being a comedian. I'm glad some of my conspiracies have come through since after the election. So I wasn't too far off. I must start charging now. I want this to become almost like I was explaining to the panel, like we're having a braai and you guys happen to be there. But luckily you'll get to ask questions as well if you have any questions. I'm very interested to know what these panelists think, apart from what their roles that we know them for have designated them to have ideas on. I just want to know, as human beings, what do they think? As South Africans, what do they think? And also the one thing that I hate so much whenever I do an event is when I get introduced, because often enough, the speaker or the person doing the introduction always gets my profile or bio wrong. And they mention things that I did when I was very young and very regretful. So I would like to return paid forward now, and just starting from that side, Prof, introduce yourself, tell us what you're known for now, not before or prior. What you are proud of now that you do. And Lourensa will do the same, and Mr. Maroga will do the same, and then we'll just kick off the conversation. We'll have a question and answer session later on, probably 45 minutes into the conversation. You guys are more than welcome to pick the audience's brain, and let's make this a nice conversation and a great podcast. Welcome.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. I know the Sandton traffic is hectic this time, but it's frightening in itself. What I've done the last year or so is I was chair of the negotiations, the multi-party charter negotiations, the moon pack of 15 political parties, getting 15 political parties together into one. And then I did the modeling of the government of national unity. So the model that is there, and so I'm very excited. Although I'm absolutely not involved at it at all. I'm on the sidelines and I'm wishing them well. And maybe from a more personal point of view, I recently took over Jacana Publishers. It's sort of a hard thing. I thought at this age I can do hard things. So for any of you who wants to write, I'm on the lookout. Sorry, I'm now advertising. I'm at university, but that's really, really part-time. No one sees me. I've got a little corner office, which is always locked, where so I do very specialized programs. So I train, so every member of parliament, the last 10 or so years, have spent 5 years with me in South Africa, and then I run a course for members of parliament of the British Commonwealth, so India, the UK, Canada. So I run an ethics, so members of parliament, I run a program for them on how to be an ethical member of parliament. I know that's an oxymoron, it's because MP and so on. And then more recently, I've actually begun to run programs for cabinet. So I did just before the GNU did the cabinet, so I got the extended cabinet in front of me, and to look at development. So, yeah.
My name is Lourensa Eckard. I'm a journalist and television presenter. I'm a first language Afrikaans speaker, but full disclosure, I'm not a member of AfriForum or Solidariteit. That's me. For the past year, I think, as many South African journalists, we've just been covering the post-election fallout. I was just saying to the Prof, since the beginning of the year, on my news program on kykNET, In Gesprek, on a Monday night, we've been covering President Donald Trump every night. So it's been an eventful start to the year.
Amazing. So you have one payslip, 2 payslips.
And I'm with Carte Blanche as well.
kykNET and Carte Blanche. Yeah. Got it. Professor, when? 15 payslips. Okay. Sir.
Yeah, Jacob Maroga. My background is in engineering, but of late I'm focusing on matters to do with leadership within the energy and industrial development. That's my passion. That's my focus. Other than that, I do build solar panels. If you
From scratch?
No, well, I install. Oh, okay. We are in the energy space, so solar panel is part of what we do, but amongst other things. So that's me.
Wow, that's interesting. Good. Okay, I'd like to start with Lourensa. I've had this conversation so many times, and the last time we had it was here at this office. That's what spurred on this conversation and this interview, or this panel discussion, was the role of traditional media. You get to sit in front of an audience in a TV studio, and there's people who do it in their bedrooms now and tell the news. And we've seen how that affected the elections in the US. I mean, everywhere that we've watched, it was independent media that shaped people's opinions and got people worked up and got to stand up and go vote. Do you think in this country we are heading that direction, or do we still rely on 7 o'clock news to tell us what's what?
That's such an interesting question. I don't think we are where the United States is yet, but I think there is a crisis of confidence in traditional media in South Africa, and I think the media landscape in South Africa has become so fragmented. You have the language issue, you have different political affiliation or agenda issue, and I think the problem with linear television, that's sort of my world where I come from, is it's the strangest thing. I have this so many times on my show where I will have a guest in, and before we go live, we'll have a fantastic conversation, and I would have a very different expectation of where the conversation will go. And then the minute those lights come on, and the camera, you have that little red light, which I think the guest sees, they become someone else. And you don't have that with a podcast. You don't have that with a studio setting where you have 3 hours to sort of get to know someone. And that's what we're competing with as well. I mean, on my program, it's an hour program, but we only produce about 44 minutes of television, so there's advertisements in between. That's about 10 minutes a segment. And on some of those panels, I have 3 or 4 people, and it's not enough. So that's frustrating, I think, and I think that's why people are looking to podcasts or non-traditional media. But I would say that there are fantastic journalists and presenters working in South Africa at the moment, very experienced people. And I do hope that we keep on giving these people and their platforms a chance. I think there is a place for traditional media. Competition is always good. So I'm very excited about what the future holds for podcasts, long-form conversation platforms. But I don't think we're at the United States yet, where you have someone like Joe Rogan. I mean, interestingly, those podcast hosts have become mainstream. They have listenership, so that's bigger than the people that are tuned into CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, perhaps even. So, and it's a big responsibility. I think it's not always fair for the audience to expect from those hosts to be journalists, because they're not. And I think that there's a bit of a danger there sometimes.
Well, what's the danger?
I think the danger is that you create echo chambers, right? Like I do listen to Joe Rogan's podcasts, someone like Lex Friedman or Andrew Huberman.
Alex Jones?
No, I haven't gone that far down the rabbit hole yet. But I think it's a problem if you have one source and one person sort of shaping your worldview. Yeah, I think that's a bit dangerous, and I think that's where you need a plurality of voices, which you don't get if you only tune into Joe Rogan or the others.
Do you think journalism as a vocation or as a career is still viable? Are people still attracted? Are they queuing their adverts?
No, they're not.
To study journalism?
They're not, and I don't think they have to. I did a journalism course, but I think I would have been much better served if I'd focused on something else. I did politics, philosophy, and economics as well, which I think set me up perhaps better than someone that just did pure journalism. So I'm not an advocate for someone to waste 3 years on a journalism course. I'm sorry. But you don't have to do that. Anyone can be a journalist. I mean, we're practically sitting in a room full of journalists. Everyone has a cell phone that can record sound and video. And I think everyone feels these days they have something to say on social media or somewhere else. But there's a danger to that. I think we do need gatekeepers. But if you as the fourth estate feel like you are on some kind of high horse, and I think that's again what we've seen in the United States, where the media sort of contributed to polarization because they felt like they had some kind of duty to editorialize and not give the facts, then people are going to tune out. And I think that's a good thing. It means that people are smarter than we think. And Hillary Clinton's comment of the basket of deplorables, I think that illustrated that very well.
Ultimately, everyone has someone that pays them a nominal fee.
Yes. Yeah.
If you think of all the news outlets in this country, obviously journalists are employed. They have a boss, they have an editor, they have someone who decides what goes on the news and what doesn't go on the news. And I think where the young people or the new generation finds themselves interested in non-mainstream media is the fact that they feel like they're the employers of the person telling them the news. Yeah. Because of the crowdfunding, because of the viewership and the listenership that they give that ultimately pays them. So where do we draw the line as the audience? I want to believe you. When I watch Carte Blanche on a Sunday and I see you guys chasing the mafia in Witbank, the coal mafia, I want to believe that this is true.
No, it is true.
But sometimes I'm tempted to believe Musa Kaula is actually telling more of the truth. So where do I become the discerning audience member between what I see online every hour, every minute, every half an hour to what I see once a week with you telling me what's going on?
Well, I think the answer to that is to make sure that you have a wide variety of platforms and channels that you tune into, and perhaps sort of fight against a reaction or emotion that you might feel looking at an interview or story, or say, for example, you tune into a podcast episode and you perhaps don't agree with what the person is saying. I think too often people just then tune out because it doesn't affirm your own worldview, or we all know what confirmation bias is. But in order to be an educated and informed consumer of media, because that's ultimately what we are. Yeah. You mentioned the pay slips. Yes, I mean, journalists do need to get paid as well. But there's an independent body sitting there with producers, executive producers, that make decisions about the content of what goes onto a show like Carte Blanche or a show like In Gesprek. I'm extremely lucky at kykNET and at mNET that there is no editorial interference from the high-ups. None at all. I can guarantee people that. I've never gotten a call from the boss of the channel or the powers that be to say, listen, don't say that, and perhaps don't have this guest on next time. And I've had a few very interesting characters on my show, and we've covered very interesting stories on Carte Blanche as well. But there's never been any sort of message from upstairs to say that you should temper your message. And I think, again, sorry, I'm talking a lot now. But I think a problem with non-traditional media is because you are employed solely by your viewers or the people that tune in, you might tailor your message to keep the eyeballs and the people tuned in. So I think just, have a good, sorry for the word, bullshit detector as well.
Yeah. Prof, Clarissa mentioned something interesting about not wasting, if she had known better, not wasting her 3 years in the world of academia learning how to become a journalist when there's Google now. As a person who has a corner office in academia that is always locked, would you still encourage young people coming straight out of high school to now have this hope that a higher education is going to be a way for them to buy a house in Sandhurst and drive a nice car? Because ultimately, if we tell the truth, everyone who goes to tertiary education see themselves better than someone who's unemployed, who's uneducated, or who works at the mall. If you go to tertiary, if you are studying for a degree or a diploma, you ultimately are seen as a person who's going to get a step up in life. Is it still the case with all these young people that you see wide-eyed wandering, walking around the halls of vets thinking, after this, I'm going to have a corner office as well and a nice car and a house in Sandhurst? Is it still our reality?
I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, I have another head, I'm a governor of a school. So I have a lot of parents who come to ask me when their children now goes to university. And then on the other side, I have other students who also want to ask advice. I mean, for me, the first thing is just to say, from a personal experience. I mean, I started off initially a bit in journalism. That's where I, at the start. But my peer group, when I started off, we're talking about the early 90s, none of them ever studied journalism. I mean, I did science, and everyone I know that came out of that peer group did other things and then entered journalism. So maybe I know that's a narrow conversation just in terms of everyone is a journalist now, and so on. So I would say to people, you know what, if you go to university, do something which will give you a general education for our times. So, I mean, your politics, economics, philosophy group is still, for me, a very exciting one for those who are there. I mean, tech, I'm surrounded obviously by young people and technology. So I would say, get into the tech space and so on. So, and there's also, I mean, many of my friends again, who my generation did say politics, but somehow 10, 15 years ago moved into the tech space. And not only here, they actually moved abroad and been doing very, very well in the US. So I still believe in a grounding education. I mean, it's very, very important. I mean, despite my doors being closed, I do firmly believe in a grounding, get a basic degree. But then also the second part of it is I don't believe fully in university as the only alternative. For me, there's 3 streams that's very, very important. You're either on a sort of a university stream or you're on a technical stream. And the last one is the artisan stream. In fact, I mean, now let's talk on the state of the nation. I mean, what is missing in our economic makeup, in our education makeup, is the artisan stream. And countries like our country, emerging market countries, should have a much bigger orientation towards the artisan system. So, I mean, that is very key. If you look at Singapore, you look at South Korea, if you look at Japan, after the Second World War, their rise out of poverty has been based on the artisan system, vocational education. That was a really big stream of growth. And that's what's missing in our country. I mean, it's a very, very important thing. And when we talk about the state of the nation, that should be a key part. The artisan stream, which is gone, we don't have it. I mean, it was, during the apartheid system, it was a very, very key part of the education system. So it means now that we've got a bottleneck. Everyone tries to get into university to get a job. Whereas what we sort of had, like sort of a 3-way path, university, technical, then the artisan system. I mean, that we can get that right, very, very important. And then obviously, I mean, there's the STEM, science, technology, your mathematics. I just saw, before I came here, some of the stats coming out of China. I mean, China is now producing STEM, sort of the abbreviation for science, technology, and mathematics. They every year produce more than the entire world STEM students out of high school. I mean, and sort of 40% of their high school, their matrics, 40% of them are STEM. So that's where we're supposed to be. And aside in our case now, if you look at the matrics, which just finished now, I mean, it's 13% is in that space. So we're really in the wrong trajectory. So from a state of the nation, if we want to turn around, if we want to create the jobs, if we want to create the wealth for this economy, we need to change the education system. School, get at least to a 30-40% STEM. But in that STEM, break it up also to get artisans, to become an electrician and so on.
We almost feel like we're having an evolution of how a student would look at their life. They go from where you are, they'll go to where you are, and then ultimately they'll be employed by someone like you. And Mr. Maroga, you've been at the helm of one of South Africa's biggest organizations. I mean, you've seen these high-performing individuals that you guys have given bursaries for, that got good recommendations, that end up in the hallways of your office while you're still at Eskom. If you could just, while they are walking around there with their fresh suits, pull them into a corner and then whisper something in their ear and then zap them with that Men in Black pen and they'll forget, what would you say to them when you see a 20-something-year-old walking around thinking, this is it for me? Knowing what you know now.
Yeah, let me start somewhere else, because I think Prof talking about China and talking about STEM and engineering. One of my obsession is studying societies that start from a level of development, a low level of development, and pull themselves to a very high level of development. And I think the example of China, for instance, China since 1994, when we got our independence, China has multiplied their GDP by 33%. We've only done it twice. We've doubled, but they've multiplied their GDP by 33%. Now, when you talk about the things that Lawrence is talking about, and Trump, and part of Trump's and America's obsession is that they see a society called China rising and threatening their domination. And when you look at the social makeup, and one of my obsessions is to say, so the ruling elite of China, what is this thing that's in their mind that keeps them so focused? For the past 40 years, they've had more than, or average 5 to 8% growth in GDP. They are now leading things that Europe and America used to lead. I don't know whether you know there's a car called BYD. Now, I think it's called Build Your Dream, but it's a Chinese make. Its growth has been phenomenal in the electric vehicles. In solar energy, China completely dominates 80%. In EVs, solar panels, batteries, and now vehicles generally. Now, the question I always try to figure out is what keeps those leadership, the ruling leadership, to be thinking about this for so long and to create this society that does this for so long?
Give us an answer.
I think that's an ongoing research of mine. Now, I also want to come back to another society, you know, and with my Eskom background, being in the mines and Eskom, Sasol, so I was exposed to the industrial development of South Africa. And when I was at Eskom and I was in trouble, one of the things I actually had to study was to say, but you know, I'm running an 8-year-old organization, started in 1923, and I'm sure it had these problems, but it's still here, it's growing. So the people before me and the society before me, how did they manage to do this? Now, when you ask that question, you are led to few individuals and you go back, I mean, you know. So one of the individuals that I had to study, I think most of you know, Hendrik van der Bijl, who's a big industrialist that started Eskom, Sasol, and then Sasol, ISCO, IDC, and many other industrial companies. And when you study Hendrik van der Bijl, then you go to other cadres of African, you know, industrialists, but you then go to a guy called Jan Smuts. Now, when you look at Jan Smuts and you look at, for instance, at Deng Xiaoping, the guy who built China, you look at Jan Smuts, the guy who built the industrial formation of South Africa, they are parallels in terms of how they actually thought and conceptualized how to take a country from one level of development. Now, you must understand that when Jan Smuts took over in 1910, it was after the Anglo-Boer War, and mostly before that, the Afrikaner community was mainly farm-bound. Right? And after that, Jan Smuts and his cadres actually conjured up how to take this farm-bound society to a industrial, world-class industrial society. When you think of the Eskoms, the Sasols, those became world-class industrial enterprises. And it just didn't happen by accident. Behind it, there were people and a leadership cadre that thought deeply. How do we do this? What are the foundations? How do we create society that have this? Now, when I sit back and we're now talking about the state of the nation, I'm saying, do we have a leadership, leadership, in fact, a ruling class? When I'm saying ruling class, I'm not talking about the guys in Cape Town. I'm talking about the guys in Central, the guys like you, those guys. To say, how do we actually collaborate to create a leadership and a society that can begin to take its place like the Chinas of this world? Now, if that conversation is not happening, the state of the nation is a waste of time.
There's two things that pique my interest in what you said. I think if you draw the parallels between China and obviously South Africa with your favorite young smarts, wouldn't you say how they studied and how they learned ultimately was helpful in them being the way they were culturally? If you are in China, you study Mandarin, you are comfortable, that's your home language, you also study math, engineering in that language. Also, as it were, during those days, the Afrikaans people studied in Afrikaans, and obviously they still do medicine in Afrikaans and engineering. Do you think that culture and language played a big role in how to galvanize a nation?
Yeah.
Because ultimately now we're dealing with a rainbow nation with different cultures and different languages, and obviously all these institutions don't deal with the students the same way. They all get taught either in English or a minimal one in Afrikaans.
I think it's one of the solutions. So I'm an engineer and I'm a scientist, so I don't want absolute answers.
You don't?
No, let me tell you, if you have absolute answers,
yes,
society doesn't progress. Because you now have ideologies, dogmas, and religion. The reason science expands is because it doesn't matter whether you're an Einstein or a Newton, you know that somebody will take your thing further and further as new knowledge comes. So with society as well, I think one of the things, let me just touch on China. One of the things about China, when I studied their leadership, they seem to think developing their societies like a scientific project. There's never one ideology that works. You study everything, you pick one, you improve it, and it continues. Because when you look at China, for instance, I mean, people talk China is a communist country. In fact, people who study China, it says the most free enterprise you find in China. Because, but it happens in two ways. You've got the state-led capitalism, and you've got the private-led capitalism. The private-led capitalism happens like in America. All the companies that you interface with compete and happen as if it's in America. But the state-led takes the difficult issues. Like for instance, if they say they're going to be in electric vehicles, and they have to put a lot of research into it, training into it, education into it, that is state that goes into it and makes sure that the capital that is required, that cannot be recouped in private, is actually invested in this difficult part. And once it's ready, it goes into the private, and everybody competes. Now, it's those kind of thought processes, I think our leaders should actually have taken on. Not, I think the issue about land, for instance, I think the issue of land, whether you expropriate, whether you do that, does it lead us to expanding our economy? Does it lead us to become a force in the world? If it doesn't, so what? If you see, if you are like China and you expand your economy 32 times in 30 years, there is space for everybody. So you are not fighting for a small cake. Everybody is fighting for this 32 times GDP that we have. We won't be thinking about farms, and we'll be thinking about how do we build a South African BYD? How do we build an Haval for South Africa? And in that ecosystem, if it expands, it becomes a bigger cake in the world. Why will we be fighting looking at Mr. Van der Bijl's farm and his chickens? That for me, I think is a formula that I think South Africa should be thinking about.
Eugene, can I just?
Please go ahead.
Just on the lead. I mean, you know, just the idea of leadership. I mean, you've mentioned Jan Smuts, and sorry, I'm gonna have to do adverts for myself now. Apologies. I mean, I'm coming out with a book. I'm looking at the 4 or 5 East Asian countries since the Second World War that have done very, very well. It was based on my dissertation, and South Korea, Japan, and so on. But the key thing is exactly what you're saying. If you look at the leaders, is much more broad-based, educated leaders. That's the first part of it. People who had lived many times in other countries, also not just in their own country. So, you know, there wasn't. They didn't have this sort of narrow village view for the world. I mean, I have now negotiated with political leaders in South Africa at the top end of chairing many of these processes. And not only here, I mean, I've put together coalitions outside South Africa, also national governments. And what strikes me is, sadly, in our case, but also in many African countries, our leaders at the top end are too narrow-minded. They are not widely and broadly educated. They're not curious people. And before they came into political leadership, they've never actually run anything beyond the political party. You know, so they haven't been in the real world. But you can even bring it even closer in the intimate space. Often many of them hasn't even run their family. Way.
Even the family. You took it there.
There's a side issue. But coming back in terms of, if you look at, just take Japan, and I mean, one of my heroes is the first post-war leader of Japan. And I had in the book, I have a whole chapter on just trying to explain this man who started. So now this is 1945, the Japanese, the country totally devastated after the war. Like, they're totally devastated. What they did was that all of the old political parties and political leaders and political elites, including the Japanese emperor, were all rejected by people because they said, look, you let us into this war and cause this destruction. So they actually from scratch brought a whole new political leadership into the country. Many people who've never been in politics before, taking over in a society from scratch. The Japanese leader, he was actually in politics before, but he was imprisoned and he came out to become the prime minister. And he started off with the idea of Japan has to create a commercial state, the idea of a commercial state. Although now, us academic, we studied as a developmental state, but when he came out with a commercial state, the idea would be that Japan, within 30 years, will have to be the number 2, if not the number 1 economy in the world. And how does the whole society focus on getting that right? And the very, very first part of it was in terms of to imagine some things so new that has never ever been done before. So, but you can only have the leaders with that kind of imagination who are much more broad-minded, broadly educated, who've been in other countries and other societies before, who are not with fixed ideologies and so on, and who can bring the energy of the country, the talent and the ideas of the country. The first thing, for example, that Japanese leader did was to introduce throughout the society the idea of merit-based appointments in a public service, in order to try, so the argument was that they've got nothing, they have to rebuild, and the way to do that rebuild is the quickest time, you have to get the best of society all the time, you have to find them. If you in the furthest village, you're gonna have to get you out of there, and to be part of the national process of the thinking, of the ideas, and so on. And that, unfortunately, if you talk about our state of the nation, where we are now, it was my disappointment with our politicians, and I've seen many now face to face. I've managed many of them, and so on. Is firstly, the base. Many of them, their mindsets are often exactly the same as the village that they come from. So although this person could be a cabinet minister or a member of parliament, you would think when you speak to this person, that person's worldview is that little, if the person comes from, say, Suban to Pietermaritzburg, that is the worldview. The person looks at the country as if the country is that little village. And so on, and it's extraordinary for me. I mean, when I grew up, I remember in the 80s and the 70s, I mean, I traveled quite a lot in the country when you could still travel by train, and so on. And even when I was 7 or 8, it was such a phenomenon for me to see how different our country is, how you go from one part and people look different, people speak different, the sand looks different. I mean, I remember because I grew up on the coastal side, going up for the first time to the old Transvaal, sort of that sort of area, the now Limpopo, and the ground, the sand looked different, and how different is this country. And black people, we're all so different. And now I meet our national leaders. I promise you, I mean, they look at the world is so narrow, and so on. And that maybe is a problem.
I think as South Africans, we've come to terms, especially after the last elections, that we're not in control of who leads us. We are not in control. We vote for a party, we vote on emotions, we vote based on our fears and hope that that person will carry out our dreams and hopes and aspirations to a higher level. For example, I had a conversation with my friends just before the elections. I said, do you know that as a country, as a voting constituency, you don't vote the president of the country? Parliament actually votes the president of the country. And I'm talking about people who are middle class here who know what in the world, but they didn't know that fact. But also I've had a big problem with how my daughter now is 16 and she goes to a new school. And one of the counselors, when she was taking us around the school, she was showing us the high achievers of the school for the past year, 2024. And then there were 10 of them, and she said, all of these people performed so well and they did so well. Culturally, sports, academics, science, well, you can be here one day too. And then I said to her, so where are they now? And then she said, no, this one is studying in the US, this one went where, this one. And then she counted all of them, and I said, in all 10 of these people, are you telling me none of them is a business owner? So are we here to rear a nation of employees? I hear these great ideas of how the country should be led, but we know that's not gonna happen. As we speak right now, as of 2 months ago, a month ago, all the journalists of South Africa were in a hole in Stelfontein. All the cameras were pointing there. That's where we were. So we can dream all we want, but we take our kids to the expensive schools to dream to be good employees. That's why I said to Mr. Maroga, when you meet these great achievers in your corridors when you were still CEO, what would you wish you could pull them aside and tell them about where they are? You know the examples of China, because that's great leadership in Japan and all of those countries. But unfortunately, sometimes I feel like business and CEOs abdicate their responsibility to national. Where you guys are in the cold face of it, you interact with these young people all the time when they still drive a Polo and still have these dreams of getting a two bedroom in 4 ways. You have them there. What would you wish you would have told them now, knowing what you know? In 2009, seeing how the world or South Africa has progressed to now. Because I can tell you now, most of my friends are Afrikaans. I do hobbies with them. We ride together, we shoot together. And most of them are self-employed.
But do you think that's out of choice, or perhaps because of policies that perhaps exclude them from certain positions?
Who's that?
Well, your Afrikaans friends.
No,
I assume are white.
Yeah, you Afrikaans, so you would tell me. But most of them, I think there's pride in them working for themselves. There's a lot of pride that they carry in owning their own time as well. Because when we need to do these hobbies, I'm in the arts, so I get to have free time as well. But they're in business, but they get to have the same amount of free time as I do. So I feel like for them, whenever I have these conversations, it's about their pride in having free time and owning their time and owning their own businesses.
I guess just to come back to the Chinese example, I think
you love the Chinese.
no, and I would respectfully disagree. I don't think now, with the tension with the United States,
Yes.
I don't think we should look at China as the be-all and end-all. I mean, economically, it has a fantastic story to tell, but it's not an open society. I mean, what the country does to the Uyghur Muslims, to name just one example. To control a society like that, you need to do that with an iron fist. There is no political expression.
There's no democracy.
There's no democracy. It's a dictatorship. So, I mean, in 2008, we visited China on a hockey tour, and I remember it was just before the Beijing Olympics, and they built that fantastic stadium, the Bird's Nest, and everything. And we were driving down that main boulevard, and we saw people queuing, Chinese people queuing, massive queues, and it was like months before the actual Olympics. And our tour guide told us that the Chinese are standing in those queues they're training to stand respectfully in a queue, because once the tourists come in, it's going to be more people, and they need to get used to that. But another thing that sort of shocked me was that there's not a single public holiday in China. There was one night where most of the people, like the construction sites, was operating throughout the night, because the government said that you would be able to take the afternoon off to watch the opening ceremony, but to make up for that economic loss, we need to work 24 hours for one day. I'm not sure whether...
Can I come in? I am not saying we should copy China and copy everything in China.
We have a lot to learn from them, absolutely, given that.
But if you go to Alex today, and ask the question, Alex, do you have free expression? Are you really free? Now, that version of freedom I detest. We cannot talk about our freedoms when 30%, or in fact it's probably 30% unemployment, and the youth employment about 70%. In the past 40 years, China took 800 million out of poverty. Hundreds of millions of Chinese leave China to go on holiday overseas. They come here, they're biggest. Now, to say they are not free if they freely go back home every time they leave. Okay? Now, and we have just had a fundamental shift in the ICT space with DeepSeek. Now, AI is a big area of interest for all the superpowers. And it was almost understood that China will do the manufacturing, we will do the Microsoft, the AI will be America. And some startup comes and offers something for free that is cheaper than ChatGPT.
And open source. And
it's open source and it's free, and it kills the markets in the US. Now, as a journalist, this is the thing about journalism, in fact, in South Africa, and not you particularly. Single narrative journalism. China is a dictatorship, and the people in China are not free. I do not believe that a country that produced 18 trillion, is second in the world in terms of GDP, is driven by dictatorship. They can never be. The people that built BYD, the people that built the solar panel, the people that built the electric vehicles, that are the most competitive in the world, can't be slaves. In South Africa, we may be free, and we have now. Let me just say this, that. And let me go back to John Smart and to finish my point. When you talk about a graduate, John Smart did his law degree in Cambridge. He finished when he was about 23. At age 25, he was a politician in Cape Town under the tutelage of Jan Hofmeyr. And Cecil John Rhodes was a premier, and there was a huge issue around Afrikaners and Cecil John Rhodes, because they thought Cecil John Rhodes is corrupting Afrikaners with his money as a premier. And Jan No, because this was, he owned diamond mines, he was a premier, and he was having the young Hofmeers as people that supported him in the Cape Parliament.
So he was.
There was a very huge Afrikaner contingency that says our relationship with Cecil Rhodes and the capitalists is corruption. So Jan Hofmeer and Cecil Rhodes sent Jan Smuts to Kimberley to go and protect. That was his first major speech of Jan Smuts, October 1895, De Beers mine in Kimberley. He made his first major speech, and to summarize his speech in terms of, they asked him to come and talk about the politics in the Cape Colony. And Jan Smuts, 25-year-old, fresh out of Cambridge, he says, no, the politics of the colony is a small matter. What we need to talk about, and there, at that time, there was no South Africa, there were still colonies and war republics. Age 25, fresh out of Cambridge, Jan Smuts says, look, talking about the politics of the colony is a small matter. The biggest issue we need to talk about is two things. White unity in South Africa, and the second most important thing is the united white race is the relationship with what we call the native race. Okay? So when you look at the career of Jan Smuts from 1895 to 1950 when he died, that was his major issue. White unity and how we manage the natives. Now, for me, the biggest issue is whether the 1994 political change, was it really for for black advancement, or was an extension of the Jan Smuts white prosperity, native management? Now, if it isn't, 30 years now we should be saying 80% prosperity in South Africa. Now, why am I making this point? Unless we unpack some of the institutions that we've inherited and the narratives around them, my point is that currently the framework that we may be working on, the Constitution, may be still in the mold of Jan Smuts, of a country that was actually developed for white prosperity, but manage the natives the best you can. So unless we come out of that moment and have this honest conversation about how do we create South African prosperity as opposed to continue to protect white prosperity and have a parliament in the political theater that manages the natives. Unless we have that deep conversation, we'll continue to have an irrelevant parliament. And these narratives about when you start looking at other models, they already have labels around, no, you can't look at China. China, it's a dictatorship. Because it begins to say, what other models where there's been shared prosperity of the whole nation can we look at? But what other things should we avoid in that conception? That's the point I wanted to make. Okay. When somebody says, don't look at China, the thing is, China is an $18 trillion GDP economy. South Africa is a 400 billion economy. And when China goes 5%, China creates 2 South Africa in 1 year, just by its growth. Right? And therefore, that society is worth of study. Both its good things and its bad.
You see, Lourensa, what did you do with the China thing? Now Mr. Maroga has worked out here.
No, but I need to respond to him from a point of view is very briefly. What we've created, the institutions, the democratic institutions, is appropriate for our society. But what we haven't done, we've lacked the imagination and the political will and the imagination to use the diversity of the country to build and have a long-term plan And that's what, so that's nothing to do with the institutions that we've created. The institutions that we've created, I think it is fit for purpose. But it's the people that is missing in the institutions, the quality of the people. So unfortunately, we've had a dominant party, we had the ANC. I think without the quality of leaders that, for example, let's say, some of the other societies that actually change. Now, we haven't had that. And secondly, what we haven't had, this is the world's most diverse society. Diversity brings growth. So what we haven't done, we haven't used the diversity, all of the talent of the country. I mean, if you just think about the people who've left the country, the talent, we've allowed that to happen because we've excluded them. And it's black and white and so on. And that is and I think that is what is missing. So what we need to look at is to say, in this country, how do we prevent the country from being run by a very small group that recycles themselves, who have a narrow view, village view, ideological view, doesn't have the big view that you're talking about of where we want to go, and they control the institutions, both states, but mostly state institutions, and they set the culture that even the younger people think that is the way of doing things.
I have 3 questions before we wrap up and give to our audience members here to answer. And the first one, I'll give it to you, Lourensa. Your show speaks largely to an Afrikaans audience. Last week was the State of the Nation. How do you convey that message of what was said in the State of the Nation? Because, all of us who were shocked, we thought we were good with Afrikaans people until Trump said, you guys can come. And then all of a sudden we're like, can't you angry at us? What? You want to leave? So I feel like maybe there's a gap because I don't watch Afrikaans news. So how did you break down the State of the Nation to a largely Afrikaans audience?
Oh, we didn't, because we spoke about Trump. We did a pre-sonar program, and then Trump happened. So we largely ignored what the president said. But there was more important news. No, but I mean, I think it's a big challenge. It's something that I think about a lot when I put together the show, is to make sure that it's not insular. It doesn't speak to, even though this is primarily my viewers, to make sure that you challenge the worldview and we fight against that kind of village mentality or tribal mentality. And I think that that's perhaps something that we don't see on other platforms. Like you have the same kind of experts coming on, or I think there's this idea that if you have someone that's a bit more controversial, or someone that expresses an opinion that you might find repulsive, that you might somehow be contaminated by that. Now, I fight against that. I think we should have these voices on, and we should have difficult conversations. And it's just to make sure that you speak to people, not just academia, not just economists, not just politicians or political parties. I think it's very important that we get them on and try to hold them accountable, but also just everyday people as well, business owners, teachers, union leaders. Just make sure that you speak to the whole host and a whole variety of opinion makers and South Africans.
Mr. Maroga, tomorrow is the budget speech.
Yeah.
What are you expecting? Are you expecting the same? Because I feel sometimes like they could play the same video every year. We wouldn't know the difference. Except the one would be in a building, the other one would be in a marquee like they are now, but as equal up. What are we expecting tomorrow?
You see, as long as we don't think outside the box of the society that we want to build.
Yeah.
And we continue with the traditions that have been there, and again, we can talk about this. We continue to create a society, or we live in a framework that was built for the prosperity of a small
minority
section, and all the economic and all the factors are around that. You were just going to say the same thing all over
so over and over.
I mean, it's like, for instance, when you talk about the expropriation bill, when you read it, there's nothing there that somebody's going to take somebody's farm.
Nothing.
It's
and I found a farm, yes.
Yeah. So the only expropriation that happens in 2 ways. One, if government says, I want to put a line here, and then you've got a house, and you try to negotiate, you can't negotiate, government can actually take it and give you some kind of appropriate compensation. You've got a land that is not used, it's, it's
derelict, you're not there.
And government actually can take it for nil compensation. The thing that we can take for nil compensation is very, very, and with our courts, there's no government that is going to be taking
anyone's land.
Now an Elon Musk, whose net worth is equal to the GDP of South Africa, is on our case.
40% only, 40%, not equal.
Sorry?
It's not equal. So it's 40%.
Well, the value of his valuation is about 460 billion. Our GDP is about 410. So we can have those numbers debated. But
during the question and answer.
But his net worth is a big number.
Yes, huge.
Right? But incorrectly interpreted is on our case. Right? But what I'm saying is the disproportionate attention to the feelings of a small group of South Africans against the big issues is a problem. And what I'm advocating is, unless when we talk about the ruling elite, it's not only the guys in Cape Town. I mean, these guys around the corner in the stock exchange have much more impact on the lives of South Africans.
Yeah, day to day.
The question is that when they were sitting and watching the stock exchange, how much of the whole country are they thinking about compared to their network and group?
Yeah.
That's really the point I'm talking.
Last question goes to you, Prof. I want to get this right, so I want to read it right. So, your views, do you think bills like the controversial tobacco bill should be a priority for the government in 2025? Especially if you're looking at when the government has prioritized changes to the NHI bill. You hang out with these people. You advise them.
I'm going to respond to the tobacco bill, but I'm going to the expropriation. Sorry. I mean,
you start with the expropriation, then you'll go to the other.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, for example, this is really, the Expropriation Act is an example of that lack of imagination from our leaders. I mean, 5 years ago, I addressed all of the political party caucuses to explain to them that our constitution already says that, expropriation for public interest purposes. Why now go and put together a bill? Doesn't make sense. Is it in our national interest? What is the impact of it? And as I say, speaking to the people, the response that I got was so ideological and emotional. And so it speaks to that narrow view. Because if we want to build a capitalist society, and property rights is very, very important. Now look at, property rights in South Africa is vulnerable. I mean, you drive out, someone will take your car from you, hijack your car. It's property rights taken, right? 3 weeks ago, in Mpumalanga, taxi association burned 51 particle buses, property rights. There's no accountability here. You build in KwaZulu-Natal, construction mafia come, they take your things. Property rights. You've got a flat in the inner city, CBD, gets hijacked. Property rights. Now, if you bring now expropriation, you give the states now also to expropriate. Already, lives are being expropriated without accountability. If you get murdered, we've got the highest murder rate. It's a property, your life is a property, is being expropriated with no accountability. So that is the bigger picture in terms of, so that is the trajectory. I sat down, and I can tell you with the caucuses, these are the top leaders of most of the political parties, to try to explain to them. And I explained to them, that is 5-6 years ago, and it is also, it's on public record, because journalists wrote about it. And that is the narrowness. Because I said to them, look, what do we want to do here? We've got a law, we've got a constitution. What more, why do you want to cause more chaos in a country? And secondly, also, I know now people are, I think, attacking AfriForum and so on. I mean, really, it's silly. Because
what is silly? AfriForum or the
no,
attack?
Silly, the attacks on to blame AfriForum is you need leaderships that are grown up and take responsibility. If you're going to have an anti-American policy, which has been happening for quite a while, and people like me and many others had said it will come to a point there is going to be retribution.
Yep.
For the last 5-6 years, in 2023, we almost had a retribution when both the Republicans and the Democrats in the joint committee actually tried to put together a bill to get us out of AGOA. I mean, if we still did not see the signs of what is coming, so it's not that Trump woke up one morning, it's that we have been behaving as children, essentially our leadership, our political leadership, unimaginative, irresponsible, because if you run a country, you have to be responsible. You have to think about a country's interests, not about your emotional interests and your ideological interests. And I think that really is what it is. So every policy that we take, if you're the president and if you're a governing party, to say, will this create growth in this country? Will this create jobs in this country? Will this industrialize our country? If it doesn't, don't go with that policy.
You've actually explained the property rights issue in more detail than I've ever had before. And you know, in the Firearms Control Act, you are not allowed to use deadly force to protect property. Yeah. So that one is a reality to many people who carry firearms and who would like to also protect their lives at the same time. With that said, I'd like to open the floor.
All right, you guys enjoying this conversation? Good, let's give them a round of applause. All right, we've got a question in the back.
So my question is for Lourensa. If South Africa took the Trump executive order seriously and said, okay, we're going to protect property rights, we're going to change our foreign policy so that we're no longer antagonizing America, and we're going to remove racially discriminatory laws, we're going to embrace the value of non-racialism that's in Section 1 of our Constitution, what would happen?
Well, I mean, I think we can't underestimate Donald Trump. I think he would, listen, I don't think we should go to the United States with a begging bowl. It's important for a country to stand up for what it believes in. We clearly think that it's important to stand up in the case of Palestine. That's why we took Israel to the International Court of Justice. Now that is a government decision, but there are consequences to that. The Prof just referenced an anti-American attitude and not just that, but rhetoric by our senior government leaders. I think, well, I mean, it's a difficult thought exercise because I don't think that's what our government is going to do. They wouldn't want to be seen to kowtow to the United States. What I think is important, Mark, is that we should try to make the case to the United States that, you know, to try to turn aid into trade, to try to find a way for both of us for both countries to come to some kind of agreement. And I think we spoke about the budget tomorrow. We're going to hear how precarious our finances are. We have no fiscal room for maneuver. If we are kicked out of AGOA, if we lose financial support from the United States, it's going to have serious consequences, not for our ruling elite, not for the people sitting in Sandton, probably not for most of us sitting in this room, to be honest. And I think our government needs... Our government needs to be honest about that. So it's one thing to have to take a moral stand, but there are going to be consequences, serious economic consequences. Perhaps there are smart people in the room in the United States that if we did what you suggest and we change our posture and we say to the United States, okay, listen, we are going to do this, then perhaps we will be welcomed into some kind of new conversation. And I'm sure that the United States government, not just Donald Trump, would say, we view South Africa as a friend. And I think that, to be honest, that's a much better strategy than to try to find support from our BRICS partners, who, by the way, have their own issues. Russia is focusing on the war. India, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in the United States now the past week meeting with Donald Trump, and I'm sure that they are going to have a much friendlier posture against the United States. So who are our friends going to be in the world going forward?
I think I agree with the sentiments. In fact, geopolitics got nothing about principle, it's about interest. And why would China not bother about the Israeli issues? Not because they don't feel it's an important issue, but what's in their best interest? Why would you poke a bully in the eye if you know what the bully is going to do? Whether the bully is principled or not, why poke the bully in the eye? America is a bully. It's got no principles. It's more about self-interest. And if you poke the self-interest, they'll punish you, irrespective. Yeah. They're punishing even their friends. Europe, now with Trump. So I agree with you. We need to be, in geopolitics, we need to be very strategic. What is in our best interest? What you ignore and what you focus on. And what you just say, look, the big boys must sort it out. If it's a big geopolitical issue, China, Russia must deal with it. We are a small guy, vulnerable, we will deal with things that are important. So I agree with this.
All right, let's come here.
Thank you very much. Two things. One of the last interviews that Larry King had, when they asked him about education, he said if he were to start all over again, he would study journalism. Why you need to study? Because it does not give you answers now, but it gives you a way of seeing. What has happened? It's not the media. The problem is not the media. It's because the people who are in the media are too uneducated to analyze the situation. If you look at what's happening in the world now, anybody who analyzes the world, you will see that the world is in jeopardy. We are in the middle of the beginning of a big war. The First World War started because of a very small thing, which Dr. Jacob Maroga is involved in. It's Germany and the United Kingdom fought over energy. At the time, Germany wanted faster ships, and everybody was using coal at the time. But the problem with coal is dependent on the soldiers putting the coal up. And England wanted oil. And oil was only available in Persia at the time. And all it was going to give them is 15 kilometers an hour faster than the German ships. Today, the Middle East is broken and may never recover just because of 15 kilometers an hour. If you spend your time learning about Norman Angel's books about that, about the gathering storm, you will see what the problem is. Don't let them lie to you. China, I read Xi Jinping's book, Up and Out of Poverty, which he wrote when he was 37 years old, imagining what it is today. He said, firstly, they had a meeting in 1982. They said all the old men who weren't educated, they were going to cut out. And all young people had to be educated. You know what he said? He said, a poor region cannot afford poor ideals. Education is like a nail on a wood. You must hit it with your hammer. If you can't get educated, fuck off!
Was that a question?
Okay, I think we concur with this. Thank you. Is that why you're going?
Okay, cool. I have a question for the gentleman in the red shirt.
Mr. Maroga.
Okay, sir. Yes. So, the two countries that were spoken about in some detail here, China and Japan, their revolutions or their transformation was instigated by external shocks, right? I mean, China has a long history of being a world superpower for hundreds, thousands of years, and then it declined, and then there was an external shock, and then they decided to get their act together. Japan, likewise, the Meiji Restoration before what happened in World War II. So my question is that how can South Africa produce an internal shock? What would that internal shock to you look like? As controversial as it may look, what would it look like to produce a strong state and a people with a common set of values? Because clearly this country is extremely, there's a huge fault line, at least one. Two communities with, I think, very different value systems. So how do you produce a strong state with a strong society, and a strong society undergirded by a common value system? And how do you instigate that transformation internally, that shock internally?
I like the internal shock part of the conversation, so we don't have much time.
Yeah. Partly I agree with you that quite a lot of changes come from internal shocks. But some changes come from visionary leadership, where they may not be shock, but the leader may see that without change of course, we're going to have the internal shock, and can put that vividly, that if we're on this path, this is what is coming. So the visionary leaders are able to actually do that. So I think one of the things that in South Africa, what we're going to need is a young visionary leadership that kills the old ideas and march on. And I think, and again, it's going to be beyond just one ethnic, group. It has to come from any other South African that can imagine a bigger, better South Africa for everybody. And I agree with you, shock, but that's not only the solution. A leader with vision can create it.
Yeah, we've been shocked enough.
Yeah.
Eugene, can I just very, very quick? I mean, just on your response, how do we engage? Because we know where we are. I think it's been very important with Trump administration that we don't respond emotionally. Yeah, and if we don't respond ideologically, and we don't victim blame. We don't say, well, now this is a right wing, as Elon Musk and so on. That we take responsibility to say, all of our previous policies have led us to this, right? But we have to do something about it, because it's systemic potentially in our economy, could save this economy. This could actually be our external shock that you were talking about. This, if you don't manage this, could be that external shock that will shock this country, which I don't think our leaders understand, right? So how do we get out of this situation? It's going to be really important that the ANC on its own don't try to navigate this, because it's like a red, it's like the ANC is going to like, the Trump administration, they look at the ANC, even the Democrats have issues with the ANC, to say, let's exclude the ANC, and we have an opportunity, we've got a GNU, let's take the GNU in conversation with the Trump administration, explain to them this is not an ANC government anymore, this is a multi-party government, it's a new government, but very, very importantly is their collective, bring business, civil society, and non-ANC experts into it. We may have to recall, I would say recall our ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool, because he's sort of an old ANC type of person. Bring maybe somebody totally different, maybe a Tony Leon or somebody else from a different demographic as a package. We're in a crisis because we have to, why not? Or somebody totally different. It really is going to be important. Just in terms of how do we get the visionary, from the visionary leaders, we have to get them. Our problem is also, unfortunately, the way the majority of people in South Africa look at leaders. If you sing, if you start ideology, if you blame other people for all of our problems, you are the leader. So how do we actually sift what is a leader? There are some very good political leaders right now, but people will never vote for them because they are serious, they may be compassionate, they are long-term thinking, but they don't sing. They don't blame other people. They don't come up with slogans that's so outdated. And they don't blame whether it is foreigners or the whites or white monopoly capital. So how do we break that?
Thank you very much. So we've got 5 minutes. At the core of our philosophy is discipline philosophy. And what that means is that some of these questions require a lot of runway and time. Part of the reason why we're publishing in podcast form is so you can share it with your network to continue the conversation. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to take 2 more questions, and it's based on the 2 hands that I just seen. I'm going to start with Kellen, and you can close it out. Okay?
Thank you. So I'm from the artificial intelligence space, and this is relevant to my question, because how do we cultivate that curiosity, cultivate creative problem solving in a land where, to be honest, most people, even medium income people, are in survival mode? And that's what I've seen as the biggest problem to innovation and development. So if anyone has some answers.
I think what's fundamentally wrong with what the youth consumes is what the youth is given. If you look at how many different race groups in this country consume media, you'd be shocked. Black people consume different types of TikTok. White people consume different types of TikTok. Other groups consume, and it goes by race and by class and by age. The access to information is always there, but what you get when you watch DSTV, if you're black, versus what you get when you watch DSTV when you're white is totally different as well. The kind of programming that encourages people to think out the box does not exist. So while content creators are there chasing the carrot of being paid by these content owners, they are not creating content that wakes people up. We can say all day long that DeepSeek is free, it's open source, anyone can add or do anything. The publishing space as well is there saying people must be writers, but there's so many ways that people can be writers and express their creative ideas, but there's no encouragement. We don't see a Department of Arts and Culture giving out courses on how to do social media and how to manage technology that you have already in your pocket. So that question will always stand, but I don't think it's in the government's interest, as long as we are living in a country where politicians are still living in the 1994 era and want to enrich themselves. It doesn't benefit them at all for the youth to be smart and in touch with technology and what's going on outside in the world. I mean, if you watch SABC News, they hardly talk about what's going on in the world. They talk about what's going on in Inanda. 3 gangsters have been shot again. There was a truck here, there was a cash in transit. But are they saying that that majority of people who happen to be black, who watch the 7 o'clock Xhosa Zulu news, Setswana news, are not interested in what's going on in the world? So that's where the problem is. So if you're going to talk about DeepSeek, you are too far gone. Let's start here. SABC News, TikTok, ETV News. The 7 o'clock news must talk to people like they're adults and stop segmenting them according to their age, race, and culture.
Thank you so much. Last question here, and then we'll do closing remarks from our...
Yeah, sure.
So my question is specifically for Professor Gumede. Prof, as the brains behind the multi-party charter, if you could go back in time to before the election took place, given how narrow-minded you said some of the leaders can be, if you had full power over the multi-party charter, what would you have done differently in order to make it more successful in the election? Thank you.
All right. I still have to deal with people. I still meet people. I'll be very, very careful. I'm not going to give you a full truth, but here's the part truth. I mean, obviously, immediately after the election, when the ANC dropped down to 39.7%, I mean, there was a possibility of putting together a government from the opposition parties, because in any other country, if the governing party drops to 39.7, the opposition puts it together. So there was a 2 weeks window to try to do it. I mean, I looked around, and obviously the stumbling block was EFF and MK, because they were anti-constitutional and so far off the rational radar to put them into a government. Although there were other models, and actually, I had actually prepared the group in January, so 3-4 months before the elections, of potential other models. There was the Israeli model with Naftali Bennett when he was the prime minister during the COVID period. So, so he had a government where he had an Arab party and 2 Zionist parties, but they were part of the governing coalition, but they were outside it. So they allowed the government to govern without taking jobs in the government. But that needed maturity from, say, EFF or the MK. There was the other model was in Brazil, under the Lula coalitions, Workers' Party coalitions, 10, 11 party coalitions, but there's a couple of parties there. that are part of a coalition but are not part of the government. So those are so extreme. I mean, in Brazil, the current coalition, 10, 11 parties, you've got a workers' party on the left, and then you've got very right-wing parties. They are Catholic parties on this extreme right, but they're part of this coalition, but then they are not part of the actual government, but they're there to be supportive. We needed a level of maturity from political leaders to be able to do that. So the models were there and so on, but there was a lack of maturity. Maybe the last one in terms of what I would have loved the group to do is to campaign differently. To campaign to win. So when you campaign to win, you go for the black majority. You campaign for the black majority. You don't campaign for the other constituencies. And so on. I mean, I had the Modi group. I brought the Modi campaign team here, who were very successful in India, bringing Modi to power. I mean, I went to see them. They came to come and see me. And unfortunately, their advice from our leaders were not too keen on running a campaign to win. When you run a campaign to win, you absolutely target. You say, this is the majority voters. This is black voters. We need to get it. How do we target a campaign exclusively for them? And so on. And if I would have been in charge, I mean, I was just an independent chairperson, getting them together, holding them, and taking them into the election. I was not president of the thing. I was an independent chairperson. So if it was the other way around, and it was much more statutory, I mean, that's the strategy I would have pursued.
With regards to the future of the GNU, its longevity, what is it?
I mean, the future of the GNU, I tell the leader, so first I have to say, I'm not part of the GNU. I specifically declined a job. So I was offered, and I declined it to be outside politics. So what I've told the non-ANC leaders, to imagine that they're only there until 2027, end of 2027, when the ANC has its national elective conference, because that conference of the ANC will determine whether the GNU will last. Because their conference, Ramaphosa has to exit as the ANC president, and they may get an anti-GNU leader there. I mean, there are three people, Fikile Mbolula, and then there is Lusufi Gauteng, and Masatile. Lusufi and Masatile are opposed to the current GNU. So the GNU may come to the end, and they may then have a GNU of ANC with EFF and MK. So that is, for me, going to be a stumbling block. So it's not going to be a fight between the ANC and the DA and so on, but it's an inner fight within the ANC will collapse in 2027. I think the possibility. Yeah.
Okay, here we are. Mr. Maroga, I'll start with you, and then we are having our closing comments, and we'll go this way. Then Lourensa is going to be you, and then Prof. you.
Yeah, I think the dominant closing comment that I can share is, I have no confidence in politics solving South Africa's problems.
Okay. But you took you took a long pause there.
It's qualifying.
No.
Hey,
see, anyway, competitive politics by their very nature,
yeah,
they work on differences. South Africa is so contested that if you only depend on politics to unite us, I'm beginning to have a sense that I think we're expecting too much. And probably one of the things, I'm not necessarily agreeing with Africa. It's not it's a political movement, but not a political party.
Although you love
no. I study impactful leaders. It's not about love, it's about impactful. So I think one of the formulas is going to be a social movement that cuts across, that talks about South African issues and actually creates a cohesion about South Africa. That can be a vehicle, which doesn't have to have this pressure of having to go to parliament and say, you look like this, you mustn't talk to that, but talk to the deeper things that connect us. And I think that for me is something that can be a solution for our contested, noisy democracy. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just I'm sitting here very thankful to be living and working as a journalist in a country where we can have conversations like this, where we can have robust debates, and I don't think any one of us have to worry about when we walk outside whether we would be politically targeted. We might be hijacked, hopefully that doesn't happen to anyone, but there are massive issues in our society, but political expression and freedom at least is not one of that. And I would say that, and given this time where we are now as a country, we need to seriously also think about what kind of society we want to create. There are going to be economic consequences for which countries we look to emulate or to befriend or to piss off. But at the end of the day, do we want a society that promotes individualism, individual expression? And I know that that's not going to be possible without economic freedom. But we need to be more imaginative about what we try to achieve and who we decide our friends are.
Oh, that's very eloquent, Lourensa. You should have a TV show. Prof?
I was just to say, I'm positive about a country.
You are?
I am, despite it, and I know I may not, but I seem like that. But I'm very, very positive. I mean, a key ingredient, I think, if we can run our country as a collective of all of our talents across colors, and if we can understand that one color alone won't deliver us wealth. One group and one political faction is not going to deliver us wealth, and that's a very, very important. If we can get every South African to understand that, that's the only way for us to move out of the space, and there's all of the possibilities and all of the opportunities if we do it together with all colors. It is absolutely critical. And then also, if it's not just the state, is what you're saying, politicians do not have the depth of talent. Yeah, the talent in the country sits outside politics. It's very important to understand that. So if we can build the country, politics with business and civil society and experts together, and that is a social pact, a real social pact. So even now, the Trump, here's an opportunity for us to actually demonstrate that. If the president wants to send envoys, to send it with people that totally disagree with him, or with the ANC, and that's very important. And that is actually the start that, a person may not look like you, or you may not like the person, but if the person has the competencies and the skills to turn around the country, that is absolutely important. And I think the GNU could be the catalyst, because I think what a GNU will do, I think, and I'm outside also helping that process along, I suspect what will happen is that the parties in the GNU will over time become almost a permanent coalition over time of the center. And then what will happen is at some point the ANC will split, because the ANC has postponed a really big ideological split. And it is there now. It is now those who are pro-GNU, anti-GNU is ideological split. They have to confront that, and it will happen. And then it's very likely there's a part of that ANC, the sort of Ramaphosa type of ANC, may then be with the IFP to form a coalition, and there may be parties on the outside of pro-constitutional will join, and I think that will be almost an internal shock to our political system. I'm convinced that's a possibility, and I also suspect that MK will implode, and that the EFF they've reached their ceiling, so there are lots of possibilities going into the future.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm so glad to have had you guys here and to listen to what you guys have to say. You know far more than what I do and what my friends do know when we're having conversation. But a few observations of mine that I've made in the last 6 months about this country of ours, and it was one of the conversations that we had before the elections. And I said, funny enough, this election will just determine who the middle class are, what their true colors are. And the true colors of the middle class are both black, white, colored, and Indian. People with money decided that they want to keep what they have and they don't care about everybody else. We voted in our municipalities for our councillors to keep our neighborhoods the way they are. None of us voted to keep the neighborhoods of the other people looking better. That was not what this was all about. In that queue that I was in, both black and white in our K-way jackets in the cold, all we wanted was for this place to stay the way it is, huh? And that's what we voted for. We all knew who we were going to vote for, and we did this. And then we went in there and voted, and when our councillors came out, we were like, We knew. It's what it is right now. Our kids go to great schools, whether they're black and white. There's one thing that cuts across racism. It's money. When people have one thing in common, which is a good lifestyle, a good car, good education, good vocation, good hobbies, they will find a common ground. Where the poor get left behind is they're not in the circles of people with money, whether black or white. We've come that far now. And that's what I've realized. Also, this country is full of distractions. I think when people get interested in a topic, something happens and we get distracted. One of the biggest distractions that I feel like as South Africans we're not angry enough about is the fact that our parliament is happening inside a tent. We're not angry enough. Papa Penny is making noise in parliament. It's all normal. There's people with doctorates and degrees in political science who are at home, but there's someone who was a musician in Limpopo who's sitting in parliament who decide what happens to us. And we're fine with that. When the news was covering miners in a hole and not focusing on anything else, we were also fine with it. When we were caught in the public spats of a small party that just started and ran by a president who had a term and a half, we're also fine with that. We're not angry enough, and now we're going to be angry at a few Afrikaans people that go to the Pretoria US Embassy as well. We're still distracted. We're not angry enough. What we should be angry enough is the leaders that chop and change as they wish, the parties that are small that were voted in. And I said to people before the elections, this election proved to us that politicians want to be employed. It was inasispani for politicians. They opened little political parties, they convinced us they're going to have a voice, they're going to stand there, and as soon as they got there, they got into portfolio committees, extended their pay slips, and then they forgot about us. So that's what's happening. So I think leadership doesn't only start in parliament, it starts in our houses. People must start politicizing their children. They must have real conversations with our children regarding race, regarding culture, regarding history of South Africa, regarding education, the middle class and the lower class. That's a conversation that needs to happen daily with our children. We need to acclimatize them to that. And when it comes to business, I've realized hierarchy works. Hierarchy is what supports business. One of the reasons why CEOs and managers of companies want people to come back to work now at the office instead of having this hybrid status is to maintain their status. Because you can't be a boss if no one is there. So who are you a boss of if no one is, if someone is working hybrid? So your Porsche doesn't, your package means nothing. So people have to come back to work. But we're fine with the status quo of the poor working full-time and the middle class working hybrid. We've decided what jobs are important and which people must be standing there next to Monte Casino being rained on while we are working hybrid and deciding where we're going to have coffee this morning on our day off. It is like that. It is the fact of life. This is where we live. This is South Africa. And we must start living in reality. For example, Lourensa said in her show, you guys never discussed the state of the nation. We had much more important things to discuss, right? But that's where you live. That's the world that you live in. And that's a conversation that's happening in that constituency that you broadcast to. We must start broadcasting to our constituencies and having real conversations about what South Africa is going through, what it will go through, and where it's going to go to. But I think it starts with the younger kids. Please start having those real conversations about safety, about politics, about culture, about education, about class with your children now, so that we don't end up 10 years from now when they're 25 and they're graduates and they meet Mr. Maroga in the corridors. And then he also doesn't tell them the truth. Leave now. There's nothing for you here. So I'd like to thank everyone. I hope this becomes a great conversation, and it's one of many that we're going to have in the future. Thank you so much to my guest, Timothy.
Thank you. Give them a big round of applause.